Hello everyone and welcome to the recap video of the first match of the semifinals of the New Chess Classic between Hikaru Nakamura and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. Both players are now heavyweights. Hikaru is ranked number 4 in rapid chess and Shakhriyar is ranked number 13. So without further ado, let's jump right in and have a look at the games. So Hikaru started things off with the move 1 e4 and Shakhriyar decided to play the Caro-Kann defense, which Hikaru decided to face with the two knights attack, knight f3, d5 and knight c3. Shakhriyar plays bishop g4, which is one of the most solid systems, h3, and he just gives up the bishop on f3. Hikaru captures an e6. So black gives up the bishop pair, but all these pawns do a pretty good job of blocking in white's light squared bishop. So Hikaru plays g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e4, and he castles. Now here, Shakhriyar could have taken the knight on c3 and take the pawn on e4. However, here white plays the move b3, and things are not so simple for black. If black plays the move knight bd7, Hikaru would have played the move bishop a3, and black's king suddenly cannot castle because the bishop covers the f8 square. On the other hand, if black were to castle in this position, Hikaru would play the move bishop b2, and the pawn on e4 is actually very difficult to protect for black. Because if black plays knight bd7, white can take the pawn, and black cannot recapture because that hangs checkmate on the g7 square. So, for that reason, Shakhriyar decided not to take the pawn, and he just continued his development with the move knight bd7. Hikaru took the pawn on d5, Shakhriyar recaptured, and Hikaru played the move knight to d1. Shakhriyar castled, and Hikaru played d4, putting the pawn in the center. Black dropped the bishop back, and Hikaru played the move queen to d3. Now black will often try to start some sort of initiative on the queen side with moves like b5, so queen d3 does a good job of preventing that. Furthermore, the queen is nicely centralized on the d3 square. So Shakhriyar played queen c7, knight e3, bringing the knight back into the game, and rook fc8. And here Hikaru played b3. And with the move b3, he is preparing the move c4 to open up the bishop on g2. So Shakhriyar saw what Hikaru wanted to do, and he played the move b5. And this move might look weird. Well, it stops c4, right? On the other hand, this pawn on b5 is hanging, so Hikaru decided to just take it. Shakhriyar played queen c3, hitting the rook on a1 and the pawn on d4. So Hikaru played rook b1, queen takes d4, and c4. Once again, he's trying to open up the bishop on g2. Like he has the two bishops. If you have the two bishops, you often want to open up the position. That's where the bishops really come to life. So Shakhriyar played rook a b8, hitting the queen and stepping out of the bishop's diagonal. So Hikaru played queen a6, hitting the bishop on d6, and Shakhriyar played queen b6. The queens were traded, and Hikaru took on d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5. And here Shakhriyar made a mistake. He should have taken with the knight on d5, at least forcing white to give up the bishop pair. And white has a better pawn structure here. Right, he has only 2 pawn islands against black's 3. Especially the pawns on d5 and a7 are quite weak. However, here white does not have the bishop pair, so black has pretty decent chances of holding. However, in the game, Shakhriyar recaptured with the pawn. Hikaru played bishop e3, bishop c5. Hikaru wanted to keep his bishop pair, so he played bishop f4, rook a8, and rook fd1. And what makes the bishop pair often so good is that both bishops control a lot of squares. Like this bishop controls all the dark squares, this bishop controls all the light squares. Anyway, Shakhriyar played rook d8, rook bc1, hitting the bishop on c5, bishop d6. Once again, Hikaru wants to keep that bishop pair on the board. He plays bishop e3, rook a b8, and rook c6, increasing the pressure even more. Shakhriyar played bishop e5, rook c5, rook d7. Now note that white should not take this pawn on d5, because if white takes, boom, rook bd8, and the bishop is lost, because it cannot move, otherwise rook on d1 would be hanging. So Hikaru played rook b5, rook bd8, and Hikaru could have taken the pawn here, but he's in no rush. He plays the move a4, increasing his pressure. He wants to go a5, kick the knight, and then take the pawn on d5. So Shakhriyar played d4, a good move, freeing up his position a little bit. Hikaru decided to take the bishop on e5, and he's giving up the bishop pair. However, in this case, he's transforming his advantage. So Shakhriyar took the bishop, Hikaru takes. a little in-between check. Hikaru recaptures. And Shakhriyar recaptured with the knight. Note that he cannot take with the rook because that allows a backrank checkmate. This king is stuck behind its own pawns. So he has to take with the knight. And here Hikaru plays the move rook a5, hitting the pawn on a7, and black can actually not defend that pawn. So Hikaru will end up with 2 connected passers here on the queen side. So Shakhriyar played g6, Hikaru played b4, even pushing the pawns before taking the pawn on a7. Knight b6 takes and rook d2. So Shakhriyar realized that he couldn't defend the pawn, and at least he decides to activate his pieces. Hikaru goes king g2, king g1, rook d1, king h2, and rook d2, pinning the bishop on g2. And here black has ideas of going knight c4, knight e3, so Hikaru decided to step the king back, rook d1, and block with the bishop. Shakhriyar played knight d5, hoping to go knight e3, trying to win this bishop, but here Hikaru played the move rook d7, pinning the knight, because otherwise the rook would be hanging. Shakhriyar played king f8, trying to go king e8, trying to break the pin. Hikaru played king f2, rook d2 check, king e1, rook d4. Hikaru played king f2, and here Shakhriyar decided to give up the knight, because if he plays king e8, that would be answered by the move bishop e5. Black would have to go back, and white could just continue pushing the pawns on the queen side. So Shakhriyar took on b4, Hikaru took on d5, and he took on a4. So here, black is down a piece for a pawn. However, all the pawns are on one side of the board, which gives black drawing chances. However, funnily enough, these players already had this position, this endgame, where white had the rook, bishop, and the g and h pawns versus a rook, f, g, and h pawns in the 2014 Olympiad in Baku, but with colors reversed. So this time around, Hikaru knew what he should do with the white pieces. So he played rook d7, king g7, rook c7, preparing to move bishop f4, putting pressure on the f7 pawn. Shakhriyar played rook a5, bishop c4, rook f5, king e3, and rook e5. Just has to wait, so Hikaru went king d4, rook f5, and g4, hitting the rook. Rook f6, bishop d5, h6, and Hikaru went king to e5. And black cannot hold this position. Eventually, white will make progress, and black is simply going to lose his pawn on f7. So Shakhriyar played rook f1, rook d7, rook e1, king d6, rook f1, and king e7. Hikaru wants to go king e8 and use a third attacker towards the f7 pawn. So Shakhriyar plays rook to d1 and king e8. Now if black were to check, white can just block with the rook. And trading rooks is not going to help black, and otherwise he's just going to lose the pawn on f7. So Shakhriyar played king f6, rook takes f7, king g5, giving up the pawn but at least activating his king. Hikaru played bishop to g2, king h4, but now Hikaru starts going after the g6 pawn. So Shakhriyar played rook to d6, king f7, king g5, but after bishop e4 it was clear that this pawn could not be saved. Shakhriyar gave a check, he exchanged the rooks, and he tried to trade at the last pair of pawns, but Hikaru played bishop f3, king h4, Hikaru took the pawn, Shakhriyar took, and here you can take with the pawn. Hikaru decided to take with the bishop, and funnily enough, if this king is in the corner, it is a draw, but that's obviously not going to happen. The king would have to go here, and Hikaru could just play king g5 and roll this pawn up the board. So a nice first win for Hikaru, taking a 1-0 lead. So the pressure is on Shakhriyar. He has to win at least one game now to get back in the match. Let's see what he's going to do. So in the next game he played with the white pieces. He started things off with the move 1d4. Hikaru played knight f6, c4, and e6. The Nimzo Indian. Let's see, 3 bishop e4. Shakhriyar played knight f3, cancels, and bishop g5. Hikaru played c5. This is all theory. Shakhriyar played rook c1, and Hikaru took on d4 and played the move h6, hitting the bishop. Both players were still playing very quickly here. Shakhriyar played bishop h4, played bishop h4, d5. Shakhriyar took, g5, bishop g3, and queen takes d5. Now you cannot take the queen, obviously, because that would hang the king. So Shakhriyar played e3, and here Hikaru took the pawn on a2. Once again, you cannot take the queen because your knight is pinned. So Shakhriyar played the move bishop d3, and he's saying like, okay, you can get those pawns, but I'm gonna get development in the meantime. Furthermore, your king's a bit weakened because you played the move g5. So Hikaru took the pawn, castles, bishop takes c3. Looks like white's just giving up a piece, but he goes rook c2. Black has to keep defending the bishop, so he goes queen to b4 and knight to b5. And here things are quite tricky. So first of all, the bishop on c3 is hanging. Bishop d6 is also a threat, and knight to c7, trapping the rook on a8. So Hikaru plays e5, blocking the move bishop d6. Shakhriyar decides to take the bishop with the rook, and Hikaru plays knight to c6, protecting the pawn on e5. And here Shakhriyar goes f4. He wants to open up the position of black's king and open up his own rook. So Hikaru plays bishop g4, hitting the queen, queen c2, and here Hikaru starts making some mistakes. He plays the move queen e7, but here Shakhriyar plays f takes e5, and he probably should have recaptured on e5, but white has quite a pleasant position after a move like bishop f5, and if trades, then recapture, and both the knights are hanging. The rook can come into c7 anytime. Knight d4 is always a move trying to hop into f5. So, but this would have been a better option for Hikaru. Instead, he played the move knight to h5, hitting the bishop on g3. Shakhriyar decides to drop back, and a6. So Shakhriyar plays knight d4, bringing the knight closer to the king side. Hikaru takes the pawn, and Shakhriyar plays rook c7, hitting the queen. So Hikaru plays queen d6, and here Shakhriyar plays bishop h7 check, king h8, and bishop f5. Once again, he wants to exchange these bishops and get a knight on f5 to do some damage towards the black king. So Hikaru plays knight g7, and here Shakhriyar plays a very strong move. He plays the move bishop g3, putting pressure on the knight on e5. So Hikaru decides that he doesn't want to allow the knight to come to f5. So he goes bishop h5, but here Shakhriyar plays queen c3, x-raying the knight on e5, rook a8, and here a really great move, knight to e6. Blocking the connection between the rook and the knight. Rook takes e6, bishop takes e6, and f6. He decides that he does not want to allow white to capture with the bishop, but white takes anyway. Black recaptures, takes rook and f8, black recaptures, and queen takes e5. And here white's up in exchange, black is completely pinned. So it's clear black has just lost. Hikaru played king h7, bishop f5, bishop g6, g4, and Hikaru played a5. And without waiting for Shakhriyar to finish off the game with a move like bishop takes g6, king takes g6, rook takes g7, queen takes, and queen f5, Hikaru decided to just resign after the move a5. So Shakhriyar comes back into the match. It's 1-1. So now it's up to Hikaru again. So Hikaru with the white pieces opens up the game with a move 1e4 again. So notice, and Shakhriyar plays the Caro-Kann. So both players are going for the same line again. Hikaru plays knight f3, d5, knight c3, bishop g4, h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, e6 is all we saw in game 1, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e4, castles, and here Shakhriyar decides to improve. He castles instead of the move knight bd7, and we see surely why castles was a better move. So Hikaru decides to take, Shakhriyar recaptures, and he goes knight d1, he goes for the same stuff. Shakhriyar plays rook e8. This move might look a bit weird, but we will see the idea shortly. d4 and knight c6. This is why Shakhriyar delayed the move knight b to d7, because the knight is better placed on c6 in this structure. Hikaru plays c3, and now the bishop drops back to f8, which was the point of the move rook to e8. Hikaru plays queen e3 again. Once again, he's trying to stop the move b5, rook c8, and knight e3. And Shakhriyar plays h5, gaining more space on the king side. Hikaru plays bishop d2, g6, and rook a1. He wants to centralize his rooks before continuing any action. And Shakhriyar plays queen a5, hitting the pawn on a2. So Hikaru plays queen b1, queen c7, and Hikaru plays rook f1, centralizing the other rook. Shakhriyar goes b5, and this is a very common idea in this structure. Black wants to go b4 take on c3, and if white recaptures with this pawn on c3 is a bit backwards. So Hikaru plays queen d3, and Shakhriyar plays the move a6. And here Hikaru plays the move b4. This might look surprising, because you're voluntarily creating a backwards pawn for yourself. However, with the move b4, Hikaru is creating the c5 square for one of his pieces. And you might think like, okay, it still seems very far off to ever put one of your pieces there. But we will see shortly how Hikaru maneuvered one of his pieces. So queen b6, and Hikaru played the move knight c2. Okay, where is this knight going? Right. Shakhriyar played knight d8, a4, knight b7, trade, and here the move knight to a1. Like the saying goes, knight on the rim looks dim, so a knight in the corner should be even worse, right? However, this knight wants to go to b3 and then go to c5. And since it's so strongly protected by these two pawns, the knight will have a very nice outpost there. So Shakhriyar plays knight d6, knight b3, knight fe4, and knight to c5. Shakhriyar decides to trade on d2. Hikaru recaptures, and here the position is still approximately equal. This knight on c5 is very strong. However, white's bishop is a bit passive on the g2 square. Black's pawns do a pretty good job of blocking the bishop in. So Shakhriyar plays rook a8, rook a1, but here Shakhriyar makes a big mistake. He could have just continued the game with a move like rook a7, doubling the rooks, fighting for control over the a-file, but instead he played the move knight to f5, allowing the move knight to d7. And white is hitting the queen, and the problem for black is that he's not only hitting the queen, he's also threatening knight f6, creating a fork. Now, if black were to play queen d8, stopping that, then white would take on a8, deflecting the queen, and then creating the fork anyway. And to make things even worse for black, after white takes here, white can also take this pawn, because black cannot recapture because the queen would be hanging. Because white would win not only an exchange, but also a pawn. So Shakhriyar plays queen c6, knight f6, and gives up the exchange. However, here it's just a matter of technique for white. Hikaru played the move rook a7, rook c8, and he played g4, trying to open up a second front. Trade. And note that the knight cannot jump back to d6, because then white can take on e6. Black cannot recapture, because that hangs the king. So instead of that, Shakhriyar had to go passive with the move knight e7. Hikaru goes rook e3, defending the pawn and preparing to slide the rook over to create checkmate threats towards the black king. So Shakhriyar played queen b6, queen a2, knight c6, and queen a6. Now, this might look like it hangs the rook, but if black takes, white can take this rook. And black cannot take with the knight because that hangs the queen. So Shakhriyar went queen d8, but Hikaru played rook b7, king g8, and he took the pawn on b5. Shakhriyar decided to go for some complications with queen h4. Hikaru drops the queen back, queen d3, and bishop d6. However, this bishop does a pretty good job of defending all these squares around the white king, so white doesn't really have to worry. Hikaru played the spectacular rook takes e6. Black cannot take on e6 because then white takes on g6. And wherever the king goes, it's checkmate. If the king goes this way, it's checkmate on f7. So Shakhriyar gave a check on h2, king f1, and took on g4. Hikaru dropped the rook back. Shakhriyar played bishop c7, and without waiting for Hikaru to play bishop h3, for example, hitting the queen and the rook, Shakhriyar resigned. So Hikaru takes a 2-1 lead, putting Shakhriyar in a must-win situation. Shakhriyar has to win the last game to tie the match. But let's see what's going to happen. So Shakhriyar plays with the white pieces. He won the last white game, so maybe he can pull off a comeback again. So again, Shakhriyar goes d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e4, knight f3 cancels bishop g5. The players are going for the same exact variation. Hikaru goes c5, rook c1. We've all seen this in the second game. h6, bishop h4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, d5, c takes d5, g5, bishop g3 once again. Queen takes d5, e3, queen takes a2, bishop d3, yada yada, takes, castles, bishop c3, queen c2, queen b4, knight b5, once again. This is the exact same line as in the second game. e5, rook takes c3, knight c6. So Hikaru clearly believes in this line. He's saying like, okay, my king might be a bit vulnerable, but I'm up 2 pawns. It's up to you to prove it, buddy. So Shakhriyar goes f4, bishop g4, queen c2, and here Hikaru decides to improve on the second game. In the second game, he played the move queen e7, as we saw, and he got into some trouble. However, in this game, he plays e takes f4. Shakhriyar recaptures, and he goes knight to d5, hitting the rook on c3. So Shakhriyar goes f takes g5, which is probably a mistake. He should have gone rook b3 instead. After which he has pretty good compensation. Once again, black's king is pretty open. He has the two bishops. Still anything that could happen. Anyway, he took the pawn on g5. Hikaru takes the rook. Shakhriyar recaptures. And Hikaru goes rook a d8. A very strong move. Not caring too much about what's happening over here. He wants to go queen d4, giving a check and winning the bishop on d3. So Shakhriyar goes king h2, king h1, queen d4, hitting the bishop. And Shakhriyar decides to give a check, king h8, and plays h3, hitting the bishop and creating some loft for the king. So Hikaru plays bishop h5, rook f6 was played, and Hikaru played the move queen e3. And here Shakhriyar's only move to stay in the game was the move bishop f4, hitting the queen, and at the same time also protecting the pawn on g5. Here, however, it does allow a check on e1, but if black gives a check, you go king h2, and black can play the move knight to d4, hitting the queen. It looks like black is doing absolutely perfect, but here white can play the move bishop e4, giving up the queen, and the bishop to e5. This might look insane, but white wants to give a check here and go for checkmate. So black has to go king to g8, and now white's best move is the move bishop h7. Black cannot take because that allows checkmate. So black would have to go king h8 instead. And believe it or not, but this is a draw after bishop e4. Black would have to go king g8 and bishop h7. So I don't know if Shakhriyar saw this variation. Could have still been a try. I don't know if he saw that this was a draw, but it was his only move to stay in the game. In the game, he played the move bishop to f2. He's covering the f2 square, however, now Hikaru can just take the pawn on g5. Plays knight e4, and Hikaru goes queen to g7, protecting the pawn on h6 and hitting the bishop. Shakhriyar plays bishop f5, knight to d4, hitting the queen, hitting the bishop. So Shakhriyar gave up his bishop, but the more trades, the better for black, because he's on material. If you can liquidate the position, that's good. Shakhriyar plays queen f2, rook back to d8, queen h4, and bishop to g6. Once again, Hikaru wants to trade off pieces. He's up in exchange and two pawns. Shakhriyar plays knight to f2, rook d5, and he played knight g4, but Hikaru decided to just take the bishop on f5. There's really nothing here white can do. I mean, if you were to take an f5 and take on h6, black can just play bishop h6, for example. This king is completely safe, and black can just start pushing these pawns down the board. So, for that reason, Shakhriyar decided to resign. So, Hikaru takes the first match. There's still a second match tomorrow, which Shakhriyar has to win to take the semifinals to a tiebreak. So yeah, we're gonna see what's gonna happen. It was a very interesting match today, and I'll see you in the next one.